Hi, and welcome to the Origins Podcast. I'm your host, Lawrence Krauss. In this episode, we all get to have some revelations about revelations. By that I mean my guest in this episode is the biblical scholar Bart Ehrman, who's written a number of best-selling books over the years that has changed my own and many others' understanding of what the scriptures are all about. He's a remarkable historian and scholar, and I've wanted to have him on the podcast for a long time, and I was fortunate enough to find some time in his schedule following the release of his most recent book, Armageddon. One of his other favorite books that I enjoyed that we talk about is How Jesus Became God, and it describes literally how the biblical Jesus changed from becoming human to divine in the eyes of the early Christians and later on, and it packs some surprises, but perhaps nothing compared to the surprises of his most recent book, Armageddon, where we learn, which is a story about the book of Revelations, and we learn that one of the most common features of Revelations nowadays in popular literature and movies, the Rapture, isn't even a part of the book of Revelations. That's just one of the many surprises and insights that we got in our discussion. And I talked to Bart not just about those two books, but also about his own voyage of discovery from being a fundamentalist young man to ultimately deciding to become a scholar and historian and follow the evidence and interpret the scriptures in terms of the evidence and the historical evidence. It's a very informative discussion. I really enjoy discussing with Bart whenever I've had the opportunity, and I hope you'll enjoy it as much as I did. Now, you can watch this episode ad-free on our Substack site, Critical Mass, if you're a paid subscriber, and those subscriptions go to support the Origins Project Foundation, or you can watch it on our YouTube channel, or of course you can listen to it any place you can listen to podcasts. No matter how you watch it or listen to it, I hope you'll be as entertained and as informed as I was with this episode with Bart Ehrman. Well, Bart Ehrman, thank you so much for being on the podcast. You're someone I've wanted to talk to for years and years, and I have admired you for so many reasons from afar. So thanks for being here.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thank you. It's great to be on your show.
Well, it's what I've admired is both your scholarship and insights into religious history and the textual context of scriptures. But more importantly, your bravery in being willing to say what you deduce, and I think for me that's the highest level one can have is saying what is letting your conclusions, not having them in advance, but actually deriving them and then explaining where they come from, and at the same time, I must admit I've spent a lot of time reading your stuff again more recently in preparation for this. I want to, during this podcast, also, you fascinate me personally as well for a variety of reasons. I'm trying to understand your attitudes. Now, I know we all have history, and I find it interesting for me, somewhat dichotomy between the, I won't say cold, but precise historical examination of the scriptures and your clear, what it seemed to me to be a clear, in your heart, love of Jesus. So we'll get there.
Wow. Okay then.
Okay. But first, and as I say, I want to talk about, you've written a new book, which is fascinating for me, Armageddon, about Revelations, perhaps the least understood book of the Bible, least referred to, and for many reasons, which we'll get to, and then I want to talk about a much earlier book, which was I think the first book of yours I actually read, which is How Jesus Became God, which is a fascinating historical examination of something that people don't realize. And I love history, of the fact that people assume perceptions were always what they are now. And in fact, books that were written 2,000 years ago, you might expect would have a slightly different set of perceptions. But and your examinations are historical, not theological. But I want to, before we go into the history of Scripture, I want to go into your history, because this is an Origins podcast, and I want to go back. So you were born, actually, we're almost the same age. You're born a year after me, in Lawrence, Kansas, which I've been to. I did a tour of Kansas once trying to defend evolution against
How'd that go?
creationism. Well, I think we won that. I think we won that particular problem. This is when this is when they were trying to introduce in high schools evolution into the science. I mean, creationism or ID into the science curriculum, and I think we won that one.
Good.
But it was fascinating to go around in various campuses and speak. But Lawrence, Kansas is I assume is a religious community. I'm assuming. I mean, your religiosity began early, but I wondered, did it begin at home?
It began at home. My parents were Christian, and we went to church when I was a kid. It was an Episcopal church. I think when I was a kid, my parents were maybe more kind of socially minded Christians rather than particularly like theological or anything. But nonetheless, we went to church, and yeah. So, and Lawrence is kind of like Chapel Hill is, where I teach now in North Carolina. It tends to be kind of one of those liberal spots in Kansas, at least because of the university, because the university's, it's a fine university, and there are a lot of, and so the kids I ran around with, a lot of them were university, faculty kids, that kind of thing.
Were your parents? Tell me about your parents. Were they didn't work at the university? Did they work at the university, or were they there for another reason?
So they met at the university after the Second World War. My dad was there on the GI Bill, and my mom just got a scholarship there. So they were both from small towns in Kansas. Neither one of them was particularly academic. My dad was in business, and he ended up being a salesman for a paper box company, and made a good living doing that. My mom was a secretary. And the interesting thing is both my brother and I, my brother's 3 years older than me, and he teaches classics at Kent State. And so we both do Greek and Latin.
Oh, really? Oh my gosh.
From a salesman and a secretary. Yeah.
Well, that I've often wondered about that. So the question is, in the household, obviously you're looking behind you, and I'm a fan of books myself, but I mean, I've read voraciously, and I always have, but did they encourage your love of scholarship, reading, for example? I mean, you both became, as I say, academics. Interestingly, my brother and I both did. Neither of my parents actually went to university or finished high school. But was it early on a lot of reading in your house?
So what they emphasized was getting a good education, and because they recognized that was the key to success. They both had come from very small and not very kind of lower middle class families, and knew that based on their having gone to college, that they had really were far above most of their friends from high school, and they just realized that would happen. And so my brother and I just independently, we were very different from each other, but we went our separate ways, and we both just ended up loving education. So they didn't push us very hard that way. They just wanted us to get good grades.
They just wanted to be educated. But having gone to university, maybe that was the difference. Was my parents didn't. They wanted us to be educated, but they wanted us to be professionals. I mean, if you think about a living, being either a religious scholar or a classicist, that's not exactly what you tell your kids. Say, hey, go out and become a classicist. That's a good way to have a living.
Yeah, no, my parents were not happy with my brother going into classics because they didn't think there'd be any way he'd ever get a job. And in my case, it was because they thought that they considered the ministry a noble profession, and they just assumed I was going to be in ministry, and so that's why they went along with it in my case.
Okay, in terms of reading early on, I mean, I assume, well, you say your family was kind of a traditional Christian family, and maybe you went to church, but there wasn't a lot of theology involved at home, I assume. So did you read the Bible when you were younger?
No, not really. Not until when I was in high school, I had a born again experience, and that's when I really got into it. But
Yeah,
in the house, I think they revered the Bible, but nobody, we didn't bother reading it much.
like most Christians, we'll get to that. Like most Christians, you
yeah.
like the Bible and think it's absolutely true, but I've never read it. And I think I think, in my opinion, that's an essential part of the reason Christianity has been successful. People actually read the Bible. Far fewer people are really religious, in my opinion. But in any case, And same as a Jew, I was brought up Jewish, and I was, I went to the high holidays and all the rest, but I don't think I was ever schooled on the atrocities, uh, uh,
Oh,
and
right.
only learned about them much later. It
Yeah.
was always
Well, yeah.
defending or
Yeah.
being oppressed rather than oppressing.
Yeah. Well, ignorance cuts both ways because I mean, in your field, you have people who are opposed to to evolution or think the Earth was created 6,000 years ago. They know nothing about it because they haven't read anything about it, but
Yeah.
they believe in Christianity even though they know nothing about it and haven't read about it.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
cuts
Yeah.
both
No,
ways.
yeah, it is fascinating that sense. Well, yeah. Well, in fact, I want to get to the people, literalists, who, in some ways, I've debated a lot of people, including and among the various people I've debated, one of the people I wouldn't say respect, but remarkably is Ken Ham,
Uh,
who at least it seems to me said, we've debated a few times at once on TV and said more or less the truth, which is, well, if any part of this isn't true, then it's all suspect. And so therefore, I agree with him completely.
yeah,
But
except for the therefore.
yeah. Yeah.
Right.
In any case, you you're reading. Did you read? No, but if you didn't read the Bible, did you read? You never. I thought. Never. Did you ever get interested in science, for example, or was you always more interested in history and fiction or nonfiction?
Mainly fiction, science fiction. So I had terrible science teachers
Oh,
from
mhm, so do
all
I.
the way up. I just had completely really awful, and so I just never developed an interest in science. And I wish I had because now I'm really interested. And I read stuff for late level,
Mm.
a lot of science stuff. But once it gets past the late level, my brain just doesn't go there,
Well,
and it
it's
just
okay,
wasn't
but
trained.
reading,
Yeah.
being interested. I mean, that's why I write books that are
Yeah, yeah.
popular.
Well, that's right. I mean, that's the kind of thing, I mean, I like reading cosmology and physics and, I've been reading, evolutionary psychology. It's just, various kinds of stuff that's unrelated to my thing. But yeah, growing up, it was all fiction. I loved science fiction. I liked fiction. That's basically it. So,
It's
when,
interesting that you say you like science fiction because
yeah,
it shows how bad schools are. Because if you
yeah,
like science fiction, it should have been a perfect jumping off place to get like science because, one
I
is,
know. I
science
know.
fiction and inspires you like science does. And in fact, I think that's what more or less what Stephen Hawking said in my book, The Physics of Star Trek. And it's a shame because that's, those
Yeah,
same questions
yeah,
are what excite, and all kids are
I know.
excited by that stuff.
They are, but you've got to have somebody who shows you why it's exciting instead of like, I mean, and if the teaching is just absolutely boring and doesn't, I mean, oh my God, just get me out of here.
Yeah,
So,
well, actually,
too bad.
I've explained. My mother wanted me to be a doctor, and my brother a lawyer because that's what good, educated Jewish boys are supposed to be, especially for parents who hadn't gone to college. And
Yeah.
my brother did become a lawyer, but one of the reasons I didn't become a doctor is for that very same reason. When I was going to school around the same time you were, or a year apart, biology was just like memorizing the parts of a frog. There could be nothing more boring and tedious
Mm,
and I feel sad now that I missed out. I mean,
mm,
I've obviously educated myself since then, but that was around the time when all sorts of exciting things were being learned, including genetics and the
mm.
structure of DNA. But no, it was all these ridiculous. So in schools, we unfortunately um, teach science as if it's a bunch of facts rather than a process. Interestingly enough, whereas as far as I can tell in Bible studies it is taught as a bunch. I mean, people memorize a lot. I mean, I'm always, whenever I've been on stage with people, including theologians, besides apologists, um, they always remember all the passages, and
Yeah.
it seems a central part of biblical training. Another reason, probably, I was by character naturally turned off by religion because I don't like to memorize things like that. But what
Uh,
was your? I wanna get to the. So you were around teenager when you had your born again experience. Um,
yeah, I guess it was probably my beginning of my junior year in high school. I was maybe 15, I guess. Yeah. And yeah, I started attending a kind of a youth group that was a high school youth group. It wasn't connected with high school, obviously, but it was, it was led by a guy who was a charismatic fellow who, big personality, who convinced people that they had to believe in Jesus. and thought I did. I went to church. No, 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 that doesn't count. You gotta have a born again experience. And so, okay, so I went for it, and that's yeah. At that point, I became I didn't come like completely devout off the bat. I still, I hung out with kids who were. I was on the debate team, and I hung out
Yeah,
with
I knew you went to the
debaters, and
state
I
championship.
played
I
sports,
understand.
and
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So I like that kind of thing. I was always a competitive guy, so I like sports because they're competitive. I wasn't particularly good at it, but I hung out with the sports guys too. And so it's like my life went on pretty much, except for I started developing this really intense interest in the Bible and in Christianity.
But you weren't sort of evangelical in the sense that you were forcing your friends to deal with your born again.
Oh yeah, no, I did. Yeah, no, eventually it didn't take long before I started doing. I converted basically my whole family, and converted my girlfriend, and converted most of her family.
Now, which girlfriend? Because you had a Jewish girlfriend for a while, right? Didn't you?
Yeah, I couldn't convert her.
Yeah, yeah. I was wondering about that. Did you try, or well, you did, I think, right?
No, no, I didn't convert. Her mom was worried. We were sophomores when we got together, and her mom was worried about our relationship, so she moved her to a different town.
But
So doing it on the phone didn't work too well.
I now remember. I forget which book I was reading it in, but a wonderful episode where you did tell her to sort of accept Jesus, and she said, "I've already accepted God. Why do I have to do it?" And I think you said you just didn't know how to answer that question. It was a pretty good
I
response.
was clueless. I was just because it was just because my whole answer. She said, "Well, why would I need Jesus? I've already got God." And I had no idea. I said, "Well, if you got him, you might as well take him."
Well, it was good training
uh,
for
was
evangelical, I guess. But is
yeah.
um so it was just that it wasn't you didn't have an epiphany or some you didn't see Jesus when you woke up in the morning or I mean it was more the teaching of that
I
of that. You want to explain? I mean, did you
Yeah,
have that
but
with
I
that
really didn't
born
have
again
an
moment
experience.
when you felt like
Yeah.
Jesus was talking to you?
Oh yeah. Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. Yep. Yep. Kneeling by my bed, accepted Jesus into my heart. My life was changed, born again. Yeah.
One day.
Absolutely. And then
Was
later in my life, one day, 1 minute, like it was like there was a moment. There's a
yeah.
point in time, and I absolutely remember. There was a later point in time, maybe a year later. You may not be familiar with this language. I received the gift of the Spirit. So
Okay.
for Pentecostal Christians or charismatic Christians who speak in tongues and
Yeah, sure.
that's another moment.
Yeah.
That's like a step up. That's when you're
Cool.
ascending the spiritual ladder. So I had
I
that
see.
too. And
Oh, so did
yeah,
you speak in tongues?
yeah,
Did you do
yeah.
Pentecostal? Did you move from the Episcopal Church to a Pentecostal church?
No, I didn't, but I did start going to a weekly meeting in a charismatic group that met like on Thursday nights with high school and college kids, and we engaged in all those kinds of things. Yes.
Okay. Okay. Wow. Okay. And but your friends, okay. So what made the decision for you? You went to then you chose to go to Moody Bible College, which is where?
It's in Chicago. It's downtown Chicago.
Chicago, that's right. Okay. So
Yeah.
that's and that trains people to be preachers, I assume to be
Yeah.
and your
It's a
parents were okay with
fundamentalist.
that?
Yeah, because they didn't know, they just thought, look, he's going into ministry. That's great. And by this time they also had become much more kind of committed as Christians. And so they thought they thought it was great. And Moody it's a fundamentalist Bible college. Um, and it doesn't at the time they didn't give a degree. And so it was in terms of education about the Bible, it was great. I mean, I learned a lot about the Bible, but in terms of an education, it was terrible. I mean,
Yeah.
there's no, you don't take history classes, you take church history classes, and you don't take philosophy, you take apologetics, which
Yeah.
means defending the
Yeah, sure,
faith,
sure,
and
defending.
and
So
so
sort of a Christian
instead
version of a madrasa, I guess.
yeah, well, that's right, and strict rules, ethical rules, and strict, and so it's kind of a boot camp for fundamentalist Christians.
What made you
I
choose?
loved it, by the way. I loved it while I was there. I thought it was
How long were you
great.
there? 2 years, 3 years?
It was a 3-year degree,
Okay.
and so I majored in Bible theology, and then but I had this thing. I was a pretty good student. I was an okay student in high school. I mean, I was fine. I got good grades, but I wasn't really academically interested that much. but at Moody, because I was so passionate about the Bible because of my religious commitments, I became kind of crazily industrious as a student. I mean, I'd pull an all-nighter once a week just to study.
Just to study. And study would be reading the scriptures, or
No,
you
I'd be
were
studying
reading
for my classes.
were you
I
reading
mean,
third-party sources? Did you learn Greek then, or no? Or
I didn't then. I did after that
yeah, I
when I
know
went
that.
to after that. But at Moody, I decided I just wanted to spend all the time I could learning the Bible, learning theology, learning, the kind of church history, learning kind of these Christian topics. And I didn't actually at the time, I thought I didn't want to learn Greek yet because I thought it would take time away from learning the content. I thought I could
Okay,
learn
so
the
but
Greek
besides the
later.
Bible, when you say learning theology, you'd read theological books about the Bible, or
Yeah. Well,
interpretations.
they'd be so in evangelical Christianity, there's a there are books that are just they're theological books. So they'll be divided into topics like theology of God, and it'll all be based on the Bible. But it'll be Genesis says this, and Mark says this, and Romans says, and you kind of put together the
Okay.
systematic package from all over the place, and it's a little bit kind of strange because when you're dealing with the Bible, you're actually dealing with different authors living at different times and living in different places, but you're treating it as a unit, almost like if it'd be almost like trying to study, I don't know, chemistry by bringing a quotation from somebody living in the 18th century and somebody
Yeah.
living in the 20th century, and then you putting them all together into that one systematic thing. But that's what they do
Yeah,
for
in fact, you make a
theology.
point of people not treating the Bible like a book. It'd be like taking literature and saying, well, I'm going to take a quote from James Joyce, and then another one from T.S. Eliot, and another one from Joseph Heller or whoever,
Yeah,
and putting them together instead of reading one
yeah,
book. It's an
yeah.
interesting way of thinking. I think it's obvious. I'm obviously quite skeptical of many aspects. And one of the things I want to get to is why things have been so successful. And I think I suspect that kind of learning is a really good way to indoctrinate someone
Mm.
without having them think through the details. Anyway, that's my impression. But
Well, that's kind of right because if you're not focusing on a particular author or a particular piece of literature, but you're assuming that it's like every other piece of
yeah,
literature that it's in connection with, then they all sound the same. And so it reinforces the idea that you've got this set of these set of writings that are completely consistent with one another. Um, and you don't have a way of breaking out of that mold. So in a way, it's a kind of closed system that it's very hard to penetrate because people have this mindset based on how they're reading these
yeah,
texts.
exactly. And I think that all of these things work effectively to get I mean the point of evangelical things is to get people believing and stay believing, and I've always been fascinated by how effective religion is. I kind of wish I mean we saw in other areas of human intellectual activity we could get people to become so well, actually I don't want people to become dogmatic, but become so involved, let me put it that way.
Evolve, yeah.
But but after Moody, that didn't give you a degree, so you went to Wheaton College, which is also a Christian college, or
Yeah, it's a evangelical college. It's Christian evangelical. It's where Billy Graham graduated.
yeah.
Uh, and for me, that was a step towards liberalism.
Yeah, okay. But it was also a step towards, if you forgive towards education, because it taught things
Yes.
other
Yeah.
than the Bible, right? I mean,
No,
and
in fact, it actually is a very fine school. I mean,
yeah,
it is an evangelical school. When I was there, they advertised, and I think they were right about this, that if you look at institutions of higher learning and look at the percentage of graduates who get PhDs,
yeah.
they were number 4 in the country.
Yeah,
I
no, I
mean,
I, I know actually a
and
wonderful physics teacher from Illinois who went to Wheaton, and he's now an atheist, but he certainly went to the time and got a good ed. So they have education in all
yeah,
areas. Did
no.
you
So
now
I did have some.
go on?
I was just gonna say I took geology there. It's like it was the first interesting science class I ever had by a guy who was an evangelical Christian, but he was kind of rolling his eyes half the time
Oh,
about creationists uh,
okay.
and what did they call these? What did they call it? Uniformalism? No, what is it? What's it called? Where uh, everything happens the same as it always has happened.
Yeah. Where it all happens at the same time, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I
Anyway,
forget the word, but you're right. And
yeah,
that's
he
why I'm
wasn't
not.
he wasn't a big fan of the devil putting fossils in the rocks to
Yeah.
deceive us all. So
Have you, by the way, speaking of that, have you ever been to the Creation Museum? Have you? I have.
no, I can't bring myself to do it. I probably should.
Well, as I say, the interesting thing is, um, it's fascinatingly honest at the beginning, and then they pull a switch on you. As I say,
Oh,
I was at there that day, the day it opened, and then I flew to New York to do a TV show with Ken Ham, but
mm,
and they weren't going to let me in, but eventually they did it at the day it opened, and because I had a film crew with me, and I said, "Do you mind them filming me not being
uh,
allowed in?" And it was the BBC or something, and they said, "Oh, come on in," and but it's great. Right at the entrance, they say, they have two doors, and it's sort of reason or faith, and you choose more or less. It's really kind of, and
whoa.
and then and they sneak you through that, and then they after all of that biblical history, they take you out, and then they show you how science has basically made the world a miserable place,
Uh,
and then they take you and pretend to be a natural history museum. It's really
wow,
kind of a very it's well done in that way, but um,
that's
uh,
generous of you.
well, it's well, they spent a lot of money on it, but I was amazed at the honesty at the very beginning, because if you come in
Okay.
there, you say reason or faith. Okay, well, I'll take reason. But anyway,
Yeah, right.
uh, yeah, well, okay. So Wheaton was your path towards liberalization, but your degree in theology, or
No,
what was it in?
no, I didn't take any Bible or theology there at all because I felt like I'd done that at the place that really knew about those
Yeah,
things, and so why
yeah,
would I do it here? And but I also I wanted to major in English literature. It continued my interest in novels and fiction, and so I took a number of things that were really eye opening. I mean, I took courses in intellectual history, for example, and just the regular kinds of things you take, philosophy and history and English. I was a humanities guy. I was
sure.
almost
General
completely.
humanities. I mean, given your interest in history, and as something I share, by the way, but not obviously professionally as you must have that intellectual history, that learning how to do critical analysis and historical thinking, you got out of that, I assume.
Yeah, that was a big deal. And, it helped that I had done all this debate stuff when I was younger
Yeah,
because I always had to look at two sides of an argument and figure out ways to make arguments and to take apart arguments. And so this kind of education really helped a lot, even though the professors were conservative Christians, most of them,
yeah.
but they were smart people who had good training for the most part.
Now, did you only have to go to a year or two because you'd gotten some credits from
Yeah.
Moody? Is that the way it was? So and is that the reason you went? You wanted to get your undergraduate degree? Did you plan then to go to graduate school, or was it as a result of being in at Wheaton?
No, already at Moody, I realized that that I could probably go on and do graduate work. And at Moody, my idea developed my last year at Moody that I knew that there were a lot of really smart people who had PhDs who were teaching in Christian contexts, but I thought I would get a PhD and be a Christian teaching in a secular context. And I thought this would be kind of a mission field for me. So,
Okay.
so I had planned that I wasn't sure what it was going to be, and I wasn't sure if it'd be in English or in biblical studies. But I took Greek at Wheaton, and it turned out that was something I was pretty good at, and so I decided to that maybe that was the way to go, is into studying the Greek New Testament.
Okay, and then you chose to go to Princeton Theological Seminary, um, which you want to and again, I taught at Yale for a while, and I know there's this School of Divinity which I visited every now and then. Um, uh, but does the theological seminary have any connection to the university, or is it completely separate?
It's separate, and the way you distinguish them is if it's a divinity school, that
Yeah.
means it's a professional school within the university,
Yeah.
and a seminary is a separate institution. Yale Divinity School actually is a very good school. I mean, it's not, you know,
Oh,
it
no,
is
no.
not.
I
Yeah,
spent we yeah, no, no,
yeah.
I'll buy
No,
that.
no, it's but and a lot of places. most divinity schools, they're academic places. They're
Yeah.
training ministers, but they're
They're-
academic,
yeah,
as opposed to a lot of seminaries, which are not academic. They're really minister factories. And
yeah,
Princeton,
sure.
though, was both. So Princeton University started out as a minister training place,
They all did.
and then it split into the university and the seminary. So they're right across the street, and you could take classes at both places.
I
if
was
you want.
wondering if there's that class turning around. When I was again in Boston at MIT, I did class at Harvard, and in
Yeah,
fact, one of my
yeah.
good friends, by the way, did a master's in divinity, and he was an atheist, but it was kind of like the equivalent of
Uh-huh.
doing an undergraduate liberal arts degree. He just wanted to
Mhm.
continue, and he was able
Yeah.
to do it in the divinity school, which is a good place to be able to do those kind of things. So they're right across the street. Did you take classes at Princeton as well as the seminary, or did you?
Not much. They're a bunch of secularists. What do they know?
Okay, you're
So
still
actually,
that was still your feeling. Okay.
well, no, it wasn't quite my feeling. My feeling was that I was really interested in, at that point in my life, I was really interested in biblical interpretation and in the analysis of ancient Greek manuscripts. And those are two things that happened at the seminary. At the university, they definitely had a religious studies program, and they had people who worked in New Testament and early Christianity, but they had more of a kind of a social historical approach
Mm-hmm.
rather than a interpretive approach.
Okay.
And nobody over there worked in the specialized field of the analysis of Greek manuscripts. And so basically, once again, I made bad decisions and decided just to take classes at the seminary.
Well, it didn't it you came out okay. Um, but nevertheless, actually, it was a bad decision as far as you as a fundamentalist Christian is concerned, because it was there that you began, I think, to see the contradict. Correct me if I'm wrong, but as far as I understand, because you're interested in interpretation, and I think actually, and this is, I think even this is from your Wikipedia page, realized at the time there were over 5,000 manuscripts of the New Testament, and they weren't the same. And beginning to see discrepancies is what began to maybe convince you they weren't divine. Is that? Do you want to elaborate?
Yeah, that's kind of yes and no. And so the deal with the manuscripts is that I had actually known all about this before, even when I was a fundamentalist at Moody. I wrote papers on it. That we have about 5,600 Greek manuscripts of the New Testament, and we don't have the originals.
Yeah.
And so we have to figure out what the authors wrote, since we don't have their writing, but we have these later copies. And one of the reasons I went into the analysis of Greek manuscripts was because when I was a fundamentalist, I thought that God had inspired every word, but I realized there were places where we didn't know what the words were. And so I wanted to find the words.
No, I see.
And that in itself didn't lead me away from the faith. What led me away from the faith was the place from it being a fundamentalist Christian. What led me away from that was places where we were pretty sure we knew what the words were. And when you compare this passage with that passage in their original, what seemed to be their original words, they just contradicted each other. And I finally got to a point where I had to admit it, that these two passages, they really do contradict each other. And I might as well give up the attempt to show that you can reconcile them. I've been trained to reconcile everything. And at some point, if you're just being intellectually honest, say, I don't think so. This is a contradiction. That's what made me think. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the what I admire. It's the intellectual honesty. I have I actually, years later, I was invited back to an event at Yale for the 100th anniversary of some lectureship on religion, and it was me and 5 theologians. I was the token atheist, but I was amazed at how they were able to do epicircles with an epicircle. They were very intellectually facile, or not facile is not the word. Intellectually capable of taking things that appeared to be contradictions and finding some ways to make them not. And I guess I find your intellectual honesty refreshing. But you probably experienced a lot of that.
This is at Yale. Because I mean, at the divinity school,
these were not all theologians. These were people who came back to lecture about God. One was from Notre Dame, a very famous theologian from Notre Dame, for example, and who you probably know.
Because most famous theologians and serious biblical scholars, there's nobody at Yale who thinks that the New Testament is without contradiction.
These were people coming to talk about Basically, well, about God
Ah, ah, ah.
but I was surprised when when confronted with as inevitably I think anyone is, the apparent not just internal contradictions between the scriptures as different writers write, as you talk about at length in both books and in general, but the contradictions with science.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
but that's what I found amazing, is that they could take these contradictions and turn them around and do this immense set of logical steps from one to the other till they came back, and it was all, apparently made it seem consistent when it wasn't at all. I was impressed by their fluidity of that regard, but I'm more impressed by people who look at contradictions and say they're contradictions, I think.
Right, right. Well, that's a trick. One reason it's a tricky business is because I think a lot of people who are sophisticated, who are theologians, think of theological reasoning as in a different sphere from scientific reasoning, and they see that as different from mathematical reasoning, and they see that as different from sociological reasoning, and they think that these different spheres have different ways of justifying knowledge and grounding knowledge, and so they don't think not all of there's not like a view about this. There are millions of views about it,
Yeah.
but one view is that it means that you can't really use science to discredit claims that aren't
Sure.
susceptible to science. And so when somebody like like when someone like Sam Harris or somebody
Mm.
says that that it's a contradiction of science, that to be religious you have to disbelieve science,
Right.
these people just roll their eyes and say, no, actually it doesn't work that way, because scientific knowledge, it's not that they really believe there's an Adam and Eve or anything like
Yeah,
that,
yeah, yeah. No, but although some
but
would,
they think that that God talk
yeah.
somehow isn't kind of confined within the ways of science.
That's interesting. I wasn't. You just reminded me of something I wasn't going to bring up, but it. As I say, I've had chances over the years, including at the Vatican, but to speak to many theologians, because I used to get invited to lots of different places, and um, and I always ask the theologian one question, because in my opinion, theology itself is not an area of scholarship, of what I would call academic scholarship, in the sense. And I confronted them by asking them the following question. I'd say, give me one example in the last 500 years of a contribution to knowledge that theology has provided. Now, I'm not talking about history or
Yeah,
philosophy,
yeah,
but
yeah.
and
I know.
and I always got the same answer, which I guess the way you talk about it makes it clear. Every single time the answer was, "What do you mean by knowledge?"
Uh-huh.
And
Yeah.
I thought that was fascinating. I didn't quite, it really shocked me at the time, but in the context of what you're saying, it makes it clear. Like and and I would always say, well, if I asked a chemist or a biologist or a historian, they'd tell me right off. They wouldn't ask that question. What do you mean by knowledge? And I
Yeah.
think in some sense they have to, right? Because you have to assume somehow, in order to account for all this, you have to assume that there's some distinction between knowledge in the rest of the world and knowledge of God.
Well, theologians do think that they've made progress on certain issues, but since nothing is testable, it's not knowledge in the same sense. I mean, you can't, how do you show that, a particular theological view is right or wrong? And it doesn't work in the same way that where you can do some have an experiment or something
Well, in
where you can
philosophy you
actually show
can,
it.
but I guess that's what I'm saying. I mean, it seems to me what I used to
Yeah.
argue. I don't want to
Yeah.
be too controversial here or contradictory here, but I used to say, well, you could take theology and you could take the parts that are useful. There's history, there's literary criticism, there's philosophy, there's logic. Put them in their relative departments, and then there's nothing left.
Uh,
And
yeah. Yeah. No, I look, I'm on your side on this, but they would say that it's different because it has a different subject and it has a different grounding. Um, and I know people who are not in that world just think, man, that's, I don't know, they've stuck their head in the ground. But as you've experienced, there's some very smart people doing this.
they're
And so,
remarkably smart and
yeah, yeah,
remarkably
yeah,
literate, and well,
yeah.
it's really fascinating to me. And I want to, yeah, well, we'll get to that in the context of your writing later, because I'm Well, anyway, we'll get to it. I want to go in a circle. I want to start with you and I want to end with you. But if we in 6 or 8 hours from now, no, hopefully not.
Okay,
But
it's all about me.
yeah, yeah, that's right. Well, and you're the interesting person that I wanted to talk to, because I've learned a lot just both listening to you and reading you, and I appreciate it. But uh, the one just as you talked about the road to belief, that well, it was pretty quick there. It was a born again moment. You want to talk about the road to disbelief? I mean, you started to get liberal, but when did and the contradictions? Was it just the fact that there were contradictions that were inherently there that led you to disbelief, or was it more?
Actually, wasn't that at all, as it turns out. That the contradictions opened my eyes to the Bible being a very human book.
Mm-hmm.
And so this was probably my third year in my master's program. I started realizing that I just couldn't hold on to a strong evangelical understanding of the Bible anymore.
Mm-hmm.
But I remained a Christian for a long time. I did my PhD. I was a Christian the whole time I was a PhD. I actually, during my PhD, I was a minister of a Baptist church, preached on the radio every Sunday morning, and did funerals and weddings and things.
Wow.
Yeah, a Baptist church. So I stayed a Christian, and then I became increasingly liberal. I'd say I got to a point where I was a very, very liberal Christian, where I believed, I thought there was some kind of divine being in the universe, and that Jesus was the way that this divine being could be better understood. The stories about Jesus, I didn't think that we literally knew everything Jesus said or did or anything like that. But I thought that the kind of the biblical story embraced, in some sense, the kind of the ultimate meaning of the universe that's backed by some kind of divine being out there. Is a very liberal view. But at some point, probably about 30 years ago, I just gave it all up. And it wasn't because of any of my scholarship per se, my biblical scholarship. It really was because of trying to wrestle with the problem of suffering. And, whatever one thinks as a Christian, I mean, the basic line is that there's a divine being in the world who intervenes and helps people when they are in need and saves people. And I thought about it for a long time, read about it for a long time in various fields, philosophy, theology, biblical study. I got to a point where I just didn't believe there's a God who's active in the world. You just look around.
You look around.
Just look
Seems
around.
so clear to me and so obvious, but
there's so much pain and suffering among people who have there's nothing redemptive about it. Sometimes there's nothing salvific about it. There's nothing good about it. And, saying that it's all going to be made right later didn't do much for me. And somebody has to be tortured now so that they can have a nice afterlife. It just didn't make any sense to me. So I finally gave it up. It was after I came to Chapel Hill. I had been teaching here for a few years.
you were
Was
still
active
Christian.
I went to the local Episcopal church and taught adult Sunday school for some years. And
So while you were at
then,
Rutgers before, then you were still.
at Rutgers, I was still active as a Christian in a church.
Wow.
And so it's
That's
kind of
fascinating.
strange.
Moving to North Carolina to become away from New Jersey to North Carolina to become to lose your faith is kind of the opposite of most people.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I know. Who would have thought? But yeah, I know. But I just got to a point where I couldn't accept it anymore, and so left it.
Now, okay, now you call yourself agnostic, or at least written you're agnostic, but I wrote the foreword for a book called The Case for Atheism, and I had to read the book. It's an old book, so you may know the book, but I figured if I was going to write the foreword, I should read the book, and it was the first time he said something that is obvious to me in retrospect, and yet most people it didn't hit me then, and most people don't buy it, which is agnostics are atheists, in the sense that atheists don't have to be, atheists aren't people. There's some atheists who say everything is wrong. There's no God. I know it. I'm certain. Blah blah blah. But all that atheism is in principle saying is the stories don't convince me. I'm not convinced by anything I've read. And that's a whole spectrum, including agnostics who say, well, I'm not convinced by anything I've read, but that doesn't mean, there's something I don't know about. And do you buy that? Do you agree with that or no?
So I have a different view of what atheism and agnosticism are than most people have.
Okay.
When I left the faith, I had the kind of view you're talking about, which is that the atheism and agnosticism are kind of on a spectrum,
Mm-hmm.
and that agnostics are ones who say, well, I don't really know. And atheists, like a hardcore atheist says, there is no God. And with that, when I became an agnostic, I had no idea going into it that if you do polarize these two groups and have a binary of agnostics and atheists, they really are antagonistic toward one another. I just thought they'd all be kind of the same, but the way it worked out is that atheists all in this binary, the atheists all thought that the agnostics were simply wimpy atheists. They didn't believe in God, but they're afraid to say it. And the agnostics, on the other hand, thought that the atheists were just arrogant agnostics. Like, they don't know. How the hell would they know? But like they're saying
dogmatic agnostics in some sense.
Dogmatic. But now I call myself both an agnostic and an atheist.
Me too.
Because I think that they're talking about two different things. Agnosticism literally means don't know from the Greek. I don't know. So if somebody asks me, is there a superior divine being in the universe? I don't know. How would I know? But if somebody asks me, do you believe there is? I'd say, no, I don't think there is. I don't believe there is. And so I think agnosticism has to do with knowledge and atheism has to do with belief. But it ends up kind of where you are too. It means that really, I think both are both.
Both are both. If we just said atheism instead of atheism, it would be a little bit better, because it's sort of basically saying, I don't. It's not. I don't think of it as belief, but rather a lack of belief. I try to actually, as a scientist, I make it quite clear, because I'm asked all the time, "Do you believe in this and that?" And I try, although I'm not perfect in this regard, in any regard. I try to never use the word belief, because I say things are either likely or they're not likely. But from this, if I'm got my scientist hat on, the belief, there's no room for belief in science. It's
Well, that you probably know. I mean, you would know better than me. That goes back to ancient Greek philosophical traditions. Belief is kind of a second category of knowledge, and so that I would agree with that. But that's why I think they're two different belief. And I wouldn't say it's actually just a weaker form of knowledge. I'd say, in fact, it's a different category, belief and knowledge. And
Well, I mean, I guess, well, we're going place I hadn't planned to, but this is good. I'll try and get to your books as well in detail, but I hope you don't mind having a general conversation as well.
No,
because I'm fascinated to talk to someone who's thought about these things in such detail. But see, for me, I'm an old-fashioned kind of scientist, and for me, there is no knowledge but empirical knowledge. There's nothing that there may be wisdom from reflection, but no knowledge has ever been gained by revelation. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I'm a complete empiricist too. I mean, I'm a complete materialist.
Well, and you can see the empiricism in your analysis. If you want to say, you're going to say, well, what could this gospel person have thought? Let's look, and did this come from their writing? Let's see what evidence we have. And I did find it fascinating. I have to say, I found it overwhelming in some ways. Your energy to be able to explore the details of the scriptures is something it's by nature. I can't. I would never be able to devote that kind of energy to it. It's just because to me it just all seems clearly. I don't want to say nonsense, but it seems clearly myth and belief, and I guess therefore I tend to just sort of automatically by disposition sort of discount it.
No, I get that. I mean, it's like spending your life trying to, analyze the truth behind a grim fairy tale or something. Well, what's the point? I mean, it's like, it's a fairy tale. But in my case, I got so interested in it as a Christian, that interest continued because I realized there's a lot of historical and cultural importance to this material. And I'm endlessly fascinated by it, in part because so many people completely misunderstand it. But there are over 2 billion Christians in the world who believe in the Bible. It seems useful to try and figure out what it's really all about.
And it's great. And as my friend, my late friend, the physicist Stephen Weinberg, also an atheist, would say, that in trying to explain that, you're doing God's work. And I would agree with you there. But but I think it is really important for someone to be able to say honestly, here, let's talk about what's actually here, and someone with someone who isn't already typecast like me, but someone who's willing to think about it carefully and who has the appropriate credentials as well, for whatever that's worth. And that's why it's so fascinating to go through this and see in detail why most of what is conventionally believed is wrong. I mean, when I think about everything from how Jesus was always thought to be God and accepted to be God, something you clearly demonstrate in how Jesus became God was not true, to the notion of a rapture and in Revelations is also wrong. And I think it's fascinating for people to realize, especially believers, that these things that they commonly accept, because as you point out, people don't actually read it, are generally wrong. And it's wonderful and refreshing for have someone being able to say that, and not just say it, but explain in detail why that's the case, not to be contradictory or mean or spirited, but to say, I want to understand it. And I think that attitude is great.
Well, here, I mean, this is one of those places where the kind of the difference between a theological way of thinking and, in this case, it's not scientific thinking, but it's historical thinking.
I tend to think of it as empirical still.
It's empirical in a different way, because you can't, but it is empirical, historical way of looking at things. That it's different because I think I really can show that the earliest followers of Jesus did not believe he was God. That's the historical claim. Yeah. But if somebody asked me, was Jesus God? Well, I don't believe in God, but I mean, it's not like there's no way to show that. I mean, I'm like, that's a theological claim that I'm agnostic on. I mean, I don't believe it.
Yeah, although I suspect you'd be willing to say what I would say is that I can't say he wasn't, but it's unlikely.
Well, I don't believe it. I think it's wrong. I think it's wrong. But it's not wrong in the sense
based on the evidence, it's unlikely. Would you say that?
Well, there's no way.
Well, based on the evidence of the context of the time, of the developments that happened before and after,
of course. I mean, I think it's impossible. I don't think there's a God. How could Jesus be God if there's no God? So I agree with that, but it's a theological claim that doesn't have roots in the historical.
Yeah.
You see, I mean, so the historical record can't help you know about a theological claim,
which is very helpful for religion, and I want to get to it. In fact, I'm gonna get to that in a second. I want to kind of ask some. Your books made me think even more about how effectively religion, which I tend to think of as a con job, has gone through that con job. But before that, I mean, I understand. I guess I was going to ask, how can you spend so much time in the detail analyzing each of these things? But I got some perception of that. And one, I think I think it's I think it's the Armageddon book, but I think you say the New Testament is the most important collection of books in the history of civilization, and that just shocked me. I think I kind of understand perhaps the context of that, but you want to explain that? Why you say that?
I don't. Yeah, no, I don't think it's even debatable. I mean, how does one measure importance? Well, you measure importance when you're talking about cultural, social, not just religious, economic, political. I mean, throughout the history of the West, by far, the most powerful institution has been the Christian church. There's nothing compares with it for the longue durée. I mean, if you just look at the last 2,000 years, which controlled not just like knowledge about religion, it controlled knowledge of science for most of the centuries.
It was the only game in town. If you wanted to
study, the only game in town, and it's all rooted in the New Testament. So what book would compare with that?
Well, I don't know. I was assuming you came from impact. Culturally, it has had a huge impact. But if you think about, let me try and be the. I'm willing to buy that, but let me try and be the devil's advocate, which is my natural state. In terms of impact on the modern world, one could say Newton's Principia or Galileo's Dialogue to New Science in terms of changing the world in a way that allows you and I to talk across a continent without having to be beside each other. So in terms of changing the way we live nowadays, I could make the argument that those books, and you say collection of books, so I'm gonna say Principia, the Dialogue, maybe there's and a few others. works of Einstein and others, have changed the world at least as much, at least the modern world as much, not integrated over history because it's only 450 or 500 years old. How would you, what do you think?
I completely agree. Completely agree. I mean, Principia is, I mean, how do you even, I mean, in terms of the modern world, more people probably believe in the book of Genesis than the Principia, but there's no doubt,
they know it exists.
we wouldn't look,
we wouldn't be here.
Our world would not be here.
So that's why when you said it's the most important,
but I say in the history of civilization.
Okay. What about compared to the Quran then, given what's happening in the modern world? How would you compare those?
You wouldn't have Islam without Christianity, I don't think. Yeah. And the Hebrew Bible, of course, is massively important, but if without a New Testament, it would have been it'd been a set of scriptures used by, a few million people today.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be, something used by 2 billion people today.
Well, okay. So I think what I was saying when you froze is that I guess it's in that context that I can understand why you have the energy to be able to go into such incredible depth into each of the words and the statements of people, when those statements in some sense are often invented.
Yeah, but look, my wife is an expert on Shakespeare.
Okay.
And she goes really into depth. She's a Shakespeare scholar at Duke. She goes really into depth. It's crazy.
Yeah. No, it's
and it's not because she believes Shakespeare. It's not because Shakespeare's. It's their power for her. These are powerful texts that can help shape our understanding of the world.
Sure.
Put it in a very, very simplistic terms. And the Bible's like that. But and I think understanding the Gospel of John, it probably is more important to culture and society than understanding Hamlet. If you just try and measure so for me, for me as a university professor, I think most people in universities teach things that they don't believe.
Yeah.
In the humanities, especially.
Yeah.
I mean, you teach you teach Germany, 20th century German history. It's not because you want to be a Nazi. You think
it's important for people to have that context. Okay. Yeah. And ultimately, I assume, I don't want to hit you with this because look, the reason not most scientists do science is not because they're trying to save the world, as I tell you, it's because they enjoy it. So ultimately, you couldn't spend as many years and as much time and effort as you have spent working through this if you fundamentally weren't fascinated by it. I assume it's a personal satisfaction that you get from it.
Well, it is, but the thing with something like this is that it gets you into other areas that are tangential actually to the main thing. So I never spend I don't sit around studying the Bible. Mm-hmm. Lately I've been reading all sorts of Greek and Roman moral philosophy, Aristotle and Marcus Aurelius. And so, it takes me into these other areas I'm just kind of interested in that relate, but the writing has to be on these things that people really, find important.
And the fact that you have reached such a broad audience means you're obviously hitting a nerve. And I think that's right. Again, not that I want to, people will say I always bring things back to me, but that's why I write, try and connect science and culture, because I think these ideas are important, but I try and reach people in ways that they're intrinsically interested in, because they may not be,
right.
They may not perceive they're intrinsically interested in science, but they are. And so if I can reach them by Star Trek or some other
No, thank God for people like you, because people like me wouldn't have any interest in science if it was taught the way. You have to have somebody who can actually show why it really is interesting and what's interesting about it. And as you know, most scholars can't do that.
But that's true. Most scholars can't. But I was going to say, thank God. I don't sort of use those words, but thank God for people like you, and I should say, but remarkably, Christopher Hitchens. Because I would know much less about the scriptures if I hadn't read both of you. And because I wouldn't, I did read the Bible when I was younger. In fact, I read it and I read the Quran too, but not with the kind of critical eye. And so I've learned a tremendous amount. And my view, I wrote these notes to myself. By the way, I learned something wonderful, which was that religion is what it comes, it can in some sense be derived from I guess it's the Latin word cultus, Latin phrase cultus decorum, which I just love the idea as it
uh,
and it doesn't translate to what you'd think. It's not a cult so much as
no, no. Cultus Dorum is just the way you worship the God. You take care of the gods.
yeah,
And
taking care of the gods. But I think, and that's shooting. But what came out to me, the key first thought, maybe not the first thought, but when I tried to put it in perspective, both from how Jesus became God and from Armageddon, is that, as you point out, serious religious scholars know about the discrepancies. They also, as far as I can tell, know, as far as I can tell from reading, then they know that the key stories that are so central to the religion that people go to church for every week and celebrate Christmas for, that those stories, like the three wise men and the virgin birth, were not even central to the scriptures. And so explain to me how that's not a con job in a sense. If the people who are doing it know it, is it just simply because they think the ends, they're evangelical at heart and the ends justify the means? And if these stories will bring, because they believe Jesus is God, and therefore anything that will get people interested is good, even if it's not true, even if it's not true, even in the biblical context. Why do the central pieces of both the rapture, but even coming back to the three wise men and all the things that I have seen TV shows on since I was a little kid, why do serious people who know that's not true allow that to continue as being the central part of most people? They go to midnight mass and that's their religious experience.
yeah, so it's a complicated question because there within scholarship, of course, the people who teach at universities and colleges who teach biblical studies they won't agree with everything that I say. Obviously, there were disagreements, just like there are in the sciences about this, that, and the other thing. But the basic framework that I operate under is the standard operating framework within institutions of higher learning, colleges, universities, but also high-level divinity schools and seminaries. The problem is that most people who are thought to be religious experts are not those people. Those people who are scholars, by and large, they teach their undergraduate classes or even their graduate classes, but they're not out there, in a mega church talking. And so whereas you've got pastors and evangelists and such, who really are the ones who have the attention of the audiences, and most of those people really do believe this stuff. They believe in the rapture. They're not conning people. They really believe it.
Well,
they're wrong, but and they're not interested in reading scholarship to find out that they're wrong.
Yeah, because they know the truth.
They're not particularly inquisitive.
They know the answers before you ask the question. So, but
yeah, that's it.
But
yeah.
but there are a lot of Catholics, let's say, and and I was never a fan. I'm not a fan of the Pope in general, any of the popes. And I know that Francis seems like a kinder, gentler version of Benedict. I don't see any real difference. But anyway, but Benedict, I was at the Vatican and I was at a meeting that's sponsored there on the far future of the universe, and which was an experience for me. But Benedict was no fool. He was a theological scholar, yet he ran, and so therefore he knew the contradictions. But he ran what I guess is the biggest Christian church in the world, right? I mean, most Christians are Catholics, I assume. I don't know the numbers, but I bet.
Yeah. So I think in cases like that, the analogy that works better not analogy, but the example that works better for me is that my classmates, when I went through seminary at Princeton Theological Seminary, most of them are training for ministry, and most of them agree. The Gospels have contradictions. There are things you don't know what Jesus really said and did. There's no rapture coming. Most of them will not be preaching about a rapture because they're in fairly liberal Presbyterian churches, but they simply won't tell their people that they don't think there really was a virgin birth, or that, Matthew and Mark are contradicting each other all over the place. And I assume that the reason that the Pope doesn't go out with that kind of thing, and why these friends of mine don't go out when they're in churches, don't go out with this kind of thing, is because ultimately they think the religion is not about that anyway, that the religion is not about the absolute accuracy of the Bible. The religion is about a relationship with God through Christ that isn't mediated necessarily through the Bible. The idea that it has to be mediated through the Bible, that if the Bible has mistakes, religion can't be true, that's a modern concoction. That is not how Christianity is
But it's
typically
more
been.
fundamental than that. I'm not saying, yeah, sure, I understand they don't take it literally, and they view it as an allegory for at least because they believe in Christ as God. But if they recognize even that even the details of Christ as God are questionable, then is it, what came to mind when I was thinking about this is, well, as I say, I assume it's from a fundamental belief that they're doing good work, that the best thing to do is get people to accept Christ in their hearts. And even if they have to finesse it and lie or seduce them, it's still for their own good. And therefore it's okay and what came to me was, do you remember A Few Good Men, the movie? Did you ever see that with Tom? It just reminded me of Jack Nicholson. They reminded me of a kind of gentler version of Jack Nicholson saying, you can't handle the truth. You can't handle the truth. You need me here.
That's right. Yeah, I got it. Yeah, great movie, but I thought.
Yeah, but that came to mind. Do you think that's it? That they thinking that people, if most people saw the contradictions, they would give up their faith?
Yeah, no, that is right. They give up their faith, and the person and the pastor loses the job. It's a job security issue as well.
Yeah.
And so it is a very big problem. Yeah. No, I do agree with that. And it's frustrating to me because back when I sometimes still talk in churches, and like there'll be a church there, and I'll go and give some talk, and there'll be people listening to my lecture, and somebody will come up, this elderly lady will come up to me. She's been in the church for like 70 years of her life. And she come up to me and she said, "Why have I never heard this before?" And I'll look across, I'll see the pastor. I said, that guy actually was in the same class as I was in. Yeah. The reason you haven't heard it is because he's afraid to tell you. That's why. Yeah, no, that part's not good. And the thing is,
you can, clergyman,
it's very hard.
There's
because you're trying
the Clergy Project, as you know, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And I met a lot of people who, that's their livelihood. And not only just their livelihood, that's their place in the community. And their wife and or husband and children, they would be ostracized if there's all sorts of pressure to not speak about even one's own doubts.
Well, I think before somebody gets to that point, they probably are at the point that you were talking about, that they think that they can do a world of good for these people. And so they're, in some ways, I've wondered, I don't know enough about your world, but I mean, I imagine there are probably people who don't subscribe to scientific orthodoxies like a Big Bang or something, but they still teach it in their classes.
I hope not.
Really?
No, yeah, I mean, I don't, the only thing I know of are people who, and again, it's only because of religious belief. There are people, because I firmly believe people can hold two completely contradictory ideas in their head at the same time. Not only do I believe that, I know it. I can see it. Richard Dawkins talks about geologists, people he knows who literally believe the Earth is 6,000 years old, and then go in the laboratory and work on these, 100 million year old rocks.
Yeah. So I didn't mean it like that. I didn't mean
things at the same time.
Yeah. No, I didn't mean it like that. I didn't mean that somebody like is a fundamentalist who believes that God created the world but teaches the Big Bang. I meant that they subscribe to some more complicated theory.
Oh, yeah. And, well, I mean, I like to think they would talk about it. I think, it's I guess the difference, and to some extent I notice this in the kind of scholarship, it's not subscribing to theories, and I think it's I've seen it in theologians and philosophers, and historians to some extent, referring, often saying this person thinks this and this person thinks that, and taking, in their scholarly work, referring to individuals and what they say. But of course, in science, that's just not the way it is. So I don't think of subscribing to a theory. I think it's the people aren't important, and moreover, you can, if you, there are areas of science. In fact, my new book is all about that. It's the edge of knowledge. There's areas of science where we're at the limits of what we can say we know, and we know things we know what we don't know. The book in England is called The Known Unknowns. And that's where there can be vigorous debate, but no one, I think, will actually, there are debates about things like even whether quantum mechanics is fundamental. But I think, I guess the point is that people who view it as not being fundamental are open about it. There's no need to sort of teach in class. I mean, I was just had a dialogue with a wonderful physicist, Tim Palmer, who's a meteorologist and climate scientist, but he actually thinks that quantum mechanics is not fundamental. But he would teach quantum mechanics in a class. But what he would say is, and this makes it appear that a classical world is impossible. And then I think he'd explain why he doesn't think that's the case. But anyway, it's a slightly different kind of.
Yeah, no, it is.
It's not. I don't think you subscribe to schools of thought. I mean, there are fads in science, absolutely, and scientists are human, although most people don't realize it. And so people are driven by fads and preferences and peer pressure and all sorts of the rest, the same sort of things.
So the analogy I was having in mind is that sometimes when you teach something that actually isn't literally right, but the person has to know this so that you can build on it. Okay. And you don't tell them this isn't literally right. You just teach the thing, and then at a later stage they learn. And I think a lot of pastors are kind of like that. Okay. They're saying, in their head they're saying this really isn't, but you've got to know this before I can go beyond it. I'm not sure a lot of pastors, but I think there are pastors like that who are well trained and smart and just don't want to kind of blow somebody's mind before kind of getting them ready for it. I sound like an apologist here.
Yeah, well, no, I mean you're just more generous than me, I think, but it's nice. I think it's nice to assume the best in people, and until proven otherwise. And I think that I have to say, I mean, when I read you, I can't help but think that your Christian background, affects the way the way you're willing to view others, and in a good way, and as I do think that religion can do good things for people, I just think it does more harm, in my opinion, and that's my problem. But
yeah, no, I don't agree with that. But it's but it's not because I don't think I think that the harm that religion, I think religion does horrible things. I think it does a huge amount of harm. I think that same amount of harm would be done if people didn't have religion as an excuse. They would use something else as an excuse.
Okay, that's interesting because Weinberg's quote, which is I've always resonated with, which I never get exactly correctly. He said, "There are good people and bad people," and I know you talk about that. You really, at the end of one of your books, you talk about you really believe in good and evil, and that's fundamental. And it's an interesting idea because I'm not 100% certain I agree. But
I don't believe in metaphysical good and evil. I mean, it's not that I think it's a metaphysical category, but I think that, I think somebody who rapes and tortures somebody is evil. So,
yeah, absolutely. But I think what Weinberg was said, there are good people and there are bad people. Good people do good things, bad people do bad things. When good people do bad things, it's religion. That's what he.
Okay, well, it's a good line. It's a good line. I mean, when religion right now, I mean, white nationalists are using religion like crazy, and but my view is that what it does is it gives them leverage, but they would have found leverage somewhere else if they didn't have the religion.
Yeah. I think for a lot of people, I think that's true. Now, I want to actually get to the heart, a little bit more of the meat of each of those books. We've been Johnson. No, but I think this is. I hope you agree. I think this kind of discussion is useful for people to hear too. But I do want to I want to get to the meat of this because I think there are. I think some of the general issues we've been talking about will come up, and I want to start with how Jesus became God. I want to go through each. Maybe my hope is that just for your sake that we'll go about 2 hours, if that's okay with you.
Yeah.
And then so there's half an hour of next half hour of that, or 40 minutes of that, and then I want to come back to you again at the end if it's okay.
Okay.
So the central premise of that book is that the Jesus that most people think of as the Jesus that has always been, as the God and the Trinity, the 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 complex existence of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost all together and always having been in existence is not the Jesus, the historical Jesus, or the Jesus that's arisen from the Bible. And at the same time, what I loved about the beginning of how Jesus became God, not quite the beginning, but in chapter 1, and you talk about you talk about a story, and you give this story, which I just had here, and of course I've lost it but I'll get it again here, and right at the beginning of chapter 1, okay, here we go. And you say, well, there was a guy, here we go. Before he was born, his mother had a visitor from heaven who told her that her son would not be mere mortal, but in fact would be divine. His birth was accompanied by unusual divine signs in the heavens. As an adult, he left his home to engage in an itinerant preaching ministry. He went from village to town, telling all who would listen that they should not be concerned about their earthly lives and their material goods. They should live for what was spiritual and eternal. He gathered a number of followers around him and became convinced he was no ordinary human, but he was the Son of God. And he did miracles to confirm them in their beliefs. He could heal the sick, cast out demons, and raise the dead. At the end of his life, he aroused opposition among the ruling authorities in Rome and was put on trial. But they could not kill his soul. He ascended to heaven and continues to live there till this day. To prove that he lived on after leaving this earthly orb, he appeared again to at least one of his doubting followers, became convinced, in fact, he remains with us even now. Later, some of his followers wrote books about him, and we can still read about him today. But very few of you will have ever seen these books. And I went, what? And of course, you're talking about Apollonius, right?
Apollonius of Tyana, yeah.
Yeah, and so the fact that, I've talked to people who say that not only are they convinced Jesus is God, but his story is so unique that's one of the reasons they believe that. And in the historical context, it wasn't that unique a story at all. I mean, and so let me turn it to you.
Well, that's right. I mean, people today, if you talk about a miracle working Son of God, there's only one option in mind. But that's part of the point of the book, is that in the Greek and Roman worlds, there were a number of people talked about like this, who had miraculous births, who had unusual powers, who were brilliant teachers, and who ascended to live with the gods at death. And so we have stories of others like that. Nobody exactly like Jesus, of course. I mean, but nobody's like anyone else. I mean, they're all different stories, but they have these things in common. And so the idea that that Jesus was the Son of God for ancient Christians didn't mean that he was, that nobody had ever heard of such a thing. It meant that he was superior Son of God. There were actually people who wrote books about trying to argue which one of these was better, Jesus or Apollonius. And
why
on
did
both
Jesus
sides.
win, do you think? Was it just an accident of history that Jesus won, or is there something more fundamental?
Well, there are a number of things. So I actually have a book on this that's called The Triumph of Christianity, that tries to explain why Jesus and not something else. Mm-hmm. And the deal with Jesus is that there are two things. One is that the followers of Jesus said that if you accepted him and believed in him as the Son of God, you couldn't follow any of the other religions. And everybody else, 95% of the world was pagan, worshiping many gods. Yeah. And in those cases, if you decided to start worshiping Apollonius, you didn't stop worshiping Zeus or Apollo or anyone else. You accepted somebody else. But if you start worshiping Jesus, you got to get rid of everyone else. And so Christians maintained you had to do that. And if you didn't, you would be damned forever. Mm-hmm. And so what happens is Christians become missionary, whereas these other religions have no reason to go out and convert anybody because, it's all good. And they were exclusivistic. They believed that there's only one way. And since the combination of those two ended up leading to, whenever Christianity would convert people, those people would be lost to paganism. And you do that for a few hundred years, and pretty soon Christianity just takes over.
You just reminded me of a book that I read by a biblical scholar, I guess, by a woman who basically talks about how, more than any other religion, Christianity effectively in a very short time, did away, um, methodically did away with every other religion, made a point of tearing down the temples. I forget her name. Is it Maxwell? You probably know her work, Catherine.
Yeah, by the time you get to the fourth century, when Constantine converted, he didn't make Christianity the official religion of Rome,
You
but he
point that
made it
out.
an acceptable religion. And by the end of the fourth century, Christians are about half of the empire. And since they think God has rejected the other gods, they go after temples and idols and priests.
Yeah, they
And
very quickly, I mean, well, maybe not more rapidly, but what is surprising is they flip very quickly from being oppressed to the oppressors.
yeah.
And
when they do that, they give up when they were being oppressed, they argued for a separation of church and state. The state shouldn't have anything to do. Once they become the majority, they gave up on that idea. And you don't get it again until the Enlightenment of separation of church and state.
Well, to jump around again in the Armageddon, to some extent, one makes the case, and although you don't say you completely subscribe to it, that part of all of this was jealousy or desire for wealth and power, that Revelations and the judgment was basically saying, and Rome being the whore of Babylon, and was basically saying, we don't have a piece of the pie, but just wait, we're gonna get it all eventually.
Yeah, no, I think that's pretty clear in Revelation. It's driven by the desire to have what Rome has. They're unbelievably wealthy. They're unbelievably powerful. They're oppressing everyone else. And we're the good guys. We're the ones who should have all that. And so in Revelation, the Christians end up with a city of gold that's half the size of the United States.
Yeah.
And they rule the rest of the world with a rod of iron. And now they've got it. And so the whole point of the book is, it's awful for you now, but man, you're going to be on top pretty soon.
Yeah, well, and that's kind of interesting, because that, as you point out, and I was kind of intrigued, because you took it to a certain point, and then it got me thinking. I'm just amazed that the book of Revelations is in Scripture, because it certainly seems to depart from the Jesus that you hear about, who talked about exactly, at least who is purported to have talked about exactly the opposite, that you want to give up all worldly possessions, and even in heaven, it wouldn't be a matter of cities of gold. It'd be sort of eternal service to each other, and you'd be rich because you'd have the love of, I don't put it as well as you did, but you'd have the love of an infinite number of members of your new family.
Yeah. No, I think people, Jesus says things like, sell everything you have so that you will have treasures in heaven.
Mm-hmm.
And so people think, well, that means, yeah, well, I've got this $200,000 house here, man. I sell that thing, I'm going to have a $200 million mansion up there. Okay.
Yeah.
And so, but they're completely misunderstanding. Jesus' point is that the material things are not what you're supposed to be striving for. But in the book of Revelation, oh man, it's all about getting those material things.
So why? But that's my point. It is so contradictory to the rest of, well, not completely to the rest of the Scripture, and I think I want to get there, because I'm still shocked that you find Jesus to be such a good guy. Anyway,
he's a good Jewish boy.
He's a good Jewish boy, but I mean, anyway, we'll get there. But I think he talked about of judgment, and anyway, we'll get there. But but Revelations is so apparently different than the rest. I don't understand why the story of why it was eventually included into the New Testament.
Yeah. Well, the first thing to say is that it had difficulty getting in for two reasons. One was church fathers who were making decisions about these things were not sure that it was written by the same author as the Gospel of John. They assumed that had been written by John, the disciple of Jesus, John, the son of Zebedee. But they had reasons for thinking that Revelation was not written by that same guy. Mm-hmm. One thing is some of these people were very good linguists, and they looked at it and they said, this is not written by the same author.
It's not very good writing.
Mark Twain and James Joyce. It's
it
was
very
terrible writing. Didn't
you say it was very low level?
I mean, the grammatic.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
last time I taught Well, I taught a classics class for undergraduates, and I had my Greek students read Revelation, just chapter 1, and list all the grammatical mistakes. And so, just like, these Greek students could do it.
Yeah.
And so it's not very good. Whereas John, the Gospel of John is, isn't like that. It's not,
It's high
super high
level.
level Greek, but it's good. It's good. And so, but Revelation, so they thought, well, it doesn't look like it was written by an apostle. But the biggest problem they had in the ancient world, the ancient Christians, the biggest problem they had was not that it contradicted the Gospels in terms of like domination theories and stuff. And the reason they didn't like it is because when it talked about what the Christians were going to get after the judgment day, they're going to get this enormous city made completely of gold. And it sounds like they're going to be having banquets every night and just kind of reveling in all the wealth they've got. And by the fourth Christian century, most Christian leaders were urging an ascetic life where you deprived yourself of pleasure, whether it's a good drink or sex, or you deprive yourself because those aren't the things that matter. And they thought Revelation's teaching just the opposite. And so that's why they almost didn't get it in. But you ask why it did get in for a weird reason you would never expect. And one of the reasons it got in is because in the fourth century, they were having these debates about whether Jesus is really God or not. And if he's God, most everybody thought he was God, but is he really equal with God the Father? I mean, or is he must be a subordinate divinity, right? I mean, he's got to be like a second-rate divinity. He can't be as great as God. But some Christians were saying, yes, he is as great as God. And they could use Revelation to prove it, because in the book of Revelation, on several occasions, God says, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last. So like he's before and after all things. And at one point, Jesus says the same thing.
Yeah.
I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. And so theologians said they're claiming equality. So they are actually equal. And so weirdly, the book of Revelation was useful in theological controversies of the fourth century. So they put it in.
That's why, by the way, it was an accident that I read both those books together, but I found it interesting juxtaposition, because one book is exactly about that contest to try and decide what level of God Jesus was. The whole book's about it, and the other is, in some sense, Revelations is in one of as you say, one of its purposes is to ultimately, one of its utilities. I'm not sure it was the purpose of why it was written, but one of its utilities is to reinforce that notion that Jesus is God, is not just a son, a subordinate or something else. By the way, you hit something there when you talked about the Greek too, which relates to go back to this, how Jesus became God. The Greek of the John who wrote Revelations is poor Greek. The other Greek is good Greek. But as you point out, that demonstrates that it can't have been written by the people who were involved, who were largely illiterate at the time. So the people who are writing are obviously a whole different level of education and disconnected from the actual events of the time, right?
Yeah, so the Gospels are normally dated by historical scholars to, Mark is usually thought to be the first Gospel written around the year 70 of the Common Era. Matthew and Luke around 80 or 85, and John toward the end of the first century, 90, 95. But Jesus died in the year 30. So there's about a 40 to 60, 65-year gap between the accounts and the events that they narrate, and they're written by people who are highly fluent in Greek. Jesus' followers were low class peasants from Galilee who spoke Aramaic and almost certainly did not have an education of any kind, let alone the ability to compose writings, let alone to be able to compose writings in a foreign language like this. And they're clearly not written by the followers of Jesus, but by people who decades later had heard stories about Jesus. And so this is the big task of scholars of historical Jesus. Given that kind of source, how do you know what in these sources is historical and what in them is things made up or exaggerated by storytellers in the intervening years?
Well, this is my question though. Wouldn't automatically, when you hear that, especially when you know the sources are oral, uneducated people who firmly believe what they believe, doesn't that automatically shouldn't there be a radar that comes up and say automatically it's suspect? I mean, if you were to look at
Yes.
almost any oral history beyond later, 5 years later, much less 30 years later or a century later, if it's not written down and the original stories are true believers, it should all be suspect. And I don't quite understand why that isn't the prevailing assumption.
It is among scholars. So, I mean, historical scholars, this has been an issue since the 1770s. I mean, when the Enlightenment hit, it didn't just hit science; it hit history as well. And in the 1770s, you have people starting to write about what to do with these sources because they're clearly documents of faith. And as time develops, people realize more about the oral traditions and things. And so historical scholars have to use fairly rigorous criteria to work through the Gospels to decide what we can say with some assurance relates to the historical Jesus. And you can do it. I mean, because it's not different from what you have for most ancient figures. You've got sources written decades later by people who didn't know them, but they've heard about them. And there actually are criteria you can use that make pretty good sense to try and figure it out.
QML, looking for independent stories, independent textual statements, writing styles, etc., that might suggest that the story is independently coming. It's hard work.
Yeah.
But
it's hard work, and it isn't the same as.
But even if I guess I'm going back, so I can see the detective work, and I admire the detective work of people who are willing to look at the text so carefully, analyze them, and decide which sources are pre-scriptural, and but even when you've done that, the question I have is, wouldn't you? I mean, so you can say yes, these are as close to the things the apostles might have been saying as anything at the apostles of the time, but because they're oral statements of people who truly believed, even if you can focus in and say they're as close to the time as possible, they themselves are automatically suspect. I mean, in some sense, why? I guess the question is it? Well, it's really the question of why we have religion. Why are people so willing to believe stories that are handed down? I think of more recently the Mormon story, which is so obviously ridiculous, but is growing by leaps and bounds. And why do you think it is that people grasp on and are willing to believe these stories without substantiation?
Well, I mean, how many people have actually gone through the equations for general relativity?
There's a difference, though. I agree with you. You have to believe
the difference is that they. Yeah.
No, but the difference is it works. I mean,
no. I'm
saying. I mean, so people believe it because my cell phone is a GPS, and the GPS wouldn't work if I didn't incorporate general relativity.
Oh, but they don't know that. No, but they don't know. If you say E equals MC squared, people say, "Yeah, that's right." Then you explain what it means, and they say, "Oh, okay, yeah, that's what the C stands for." Oh, it's a constant.
Okay, I agree. Yeah. I agree with you
and
there.
So, they know. So you're asking, why do people believe this? It's because people believe what they're told.
Okay.
And so I'm not saying historians believe it because somebody told them. Historians have to dig down, just like scientists have to dig into the equations, or mathematicians, or people have to dig into the stuff.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And with the difference is that you do have an iPhone, and as you pointed out earlier, theology hasn't come up with new knowledge. It doesn't come up with new knowledge. So that's a big difference. But what historians do is different from what scientists do. Historians have to establish what probably happened.
Yeah.
And there are some things that are more probable than others. And so historians establish levels of probability in that way, it's kind of more like a court case than it is like a scientific
Well, no,
experiment.
I would say actually, I'd say it's almost exactly the same. It's just different qualitative levels, but I mean, or quantitative levels, we'll put it that way. When we do a science experiment, we arrive at certain levels of likelihood, and now our likelihood's much greater because we can test it. But it's
You can
still
test it,
levels
but
of probability. This is most likely true. This is extremely likely to
no,
be
that's
true. This
right.
may be true.
But you can also base it on predictions that you make,
That's
and
that's the key.
history doesn't make those predictions. I mean,
No, but hold on. But you do it. I've argued with people because I admire history so much. You do make predictions, and I think you describe in the book. You predict that you predict. You say this part of the gospel I think is pre-scriptural, and I can predict that if it's the case, I'm going to see something similar in from the same kind of linguistic or the same poetry in another gospel. So it's likely that poetry preceded both of the of those written things. So you're making predictions about things that you're going to say. I think this particular phrase or this particular stanza is significant and probably is more real likely to be
see, I
original.
don't think it's the same. I don't think it's the same because I don't make a prediction that'll be there. I notice that it's there and I draw the
Uh-huh.
conclusion. I don't make a prediction about that something is going to be discovered later and it turns out that it's confirmed.
Has that never happened to you? I'm just wondering.
Oh no, I mean, yeah, no, of course. But there it's not a prediction. Yes, but I'm it's different because all we have are past events. That's all
Yeah.
we have.
Mm-hmm.
We can't look forward to what is going to happen in the future if that past event had happened.
Yeah, yeah, no, and in fact,
You can't be a prediction of
the
anything.
reason I'm harping on this is because is partly because I want you on my side here because um, when I've debated about evolution, they always say, well, that's historical science. Historical science is different than chemistry. Talking about the early history
Yeah.
of the earth, that's historical science. But my point is they're exactly the same. Whenever I'm doing an experiment, I'm talking generally about past results. I'm
Well, look,
interpreting
you're
the
the
results of an
scientist, but
experiment.
you're the scientist, so you would know. But I don't think it's the same. I don't think that using something like Bayes' theorem for evolution or something is the same as doing a chemical
No, I
experiment
guess
that
what
you've
I'm
done a
saying when
thousand.
I'm even make in historical science, I make predictions. I make
In historical
predictions.
science, you do. Yes, that's right.
Yeah, yeah. I make predictions that there's be a fossil that's
That's right.
a missing link, and you find one. And that's
Oh yeah. Well, that sometimes happens in history, of course. I mean, it
yeah.
happens. Yeah, yeah, of course. That, but it doesn't happen very much with the kinds of things we're talking about.
Mhm.
It happens in other things. I mean, it happened. I mean, it happens in what was my field of expertise, Greek manuscripts.
Yeah.
You can predict that probably there's a manuscript that words things this way. We just don't have it yet, and then lo and behold, it'll
I
turn
got
up.
that sense in reading your book when you
Yeah.
talk about looking at in the detailed Greek about probably I expect this is there and I found that fascinating. As I say, I was amazed by the amount of energy required to do it, but nevertheless, but just take maybe spend 3 or 4 or 5 minutes talking about how Jesus became God in the sense that there were there's a difference between John and the John of the Gospels, and not the John of the Revelations,
Mhm.
and the earlier Gospels, and take us through how you think that evolved.
So the deal is that we have these four gospels, and that some of them are they're written at different times, and the earlier gospels appear to be based to some extent on yet earlier written sources, and so in some ways you can line these things up chronologically.
Mm-hmm.
And when you do that, and you look at the very earliest materials we have in the New Testament, um, when you do that and you see how they talk about Christ, they don't talk about him as somebody who pre-existed, somebody who called himself God, somebody who was born of a virgin. The earliest materials, if you line them up chronologically and you don't base your chronology on these views, you have other grounds for establishing the chronology. Once you establish the chronology, you'll notice that the earliest forms of the Christian tradition indicate that Jesus became a divine being at his resurrection. And the idea there is that he's a human, and God was very pleased with him, and so he took him up to dwell with him up in heaven. that's a view that you get in these Greek and Roman myths about other people.
Yeah.
That when a person is taken up to heaven, they're made immortal.
Yeah.
In Greek and Roman, a synonym for God is immortal. And so it's somebody who can't die anymore. So the earliest Christians thought that's what had happened to Jesus. You get it in Jewish traditions too, by the way. You wouldn't have learned this probably in synagogue or anywhere, but in the ancient world, you also have Jews who were taken up to God to be made divine beings.
Interesting.
Yeah. But so these Christians, that's the original idea. Jesus was exalted because of his service to God, his righteousness. He was taken up and made a divine being. That over time, people started trying to figure out, well, surely he wasn't just made divine after his death. He must have been like divine down here sometime. And so, did all those miracles. What's that all about? And people started thinking, well, he was made a divine being at his baptism when he started his ministry, when a voice came from heaven and said, "You are my son. Today I have begotten you." And you find that in the Gospel of Mark. And then you get further and you get people saying, well, he must have been divine. He must have been divine his whole life, right? And then you get stories of the virgin birth, where he's divine because God has made Mary pregnant. And so he really is divine. He's like, God, he's immortal by his blood or something. And so, but then you have people think, well, he must have been divine before he was born. He must have existed before that. And then you get the Gospel of John, where Jesus exists from eternity past and creates the universe and then becomes a human. So there, it's not that a human is exalted to be divine, but that a divine being has come down to be human. And so those are two kind of basic ways of understanding who Christ is. One is that he's a human that gets exalted, and the other is that he's a divine being who becomes human. And all of that's happening within the first 70, 80 years of Christianity. And in my book, I try to talk about how it even goes farther than that then.
Yeah.
Into God and Christ being equal with God and always existing.
And the other thing you point out, which I think is important, is that those different views of divinity all existed in the pre-Christ world. It all existed in the ancient world. Different ways. There were, as you say, humans who'd been taken up and become divine. There were gods, especially the Greek gods who used to like to have sex with, and Roman gods who used to like to have sex with mortals. And there were ones who'd be, so there were all of those
and some
different
who were
kinds
born.
of Christ were prevalent in the other myths at the time.
And so you have different Christians saying these things about Jesus that they were saying about various other people at the time. And it's a development in time, because as time goes on, Christ becomes more and more divine. But it's not a completely linear development, because you have people having older views at later times, and views that became prominent later, they were making earlier. And just like, you can't say that if somebody believes in a 6,000-year-old world that they must be living 2,000 years ago. You got people like that now. And so you have more advanced views early and less advanced views later.
Okay, there's three other things I'd be remiss if I didn't cover. One related to Jesus, and then two other related to the Revelations. One is a central part of all of these aspects of Christ being divine, regardless of whether it was all the time or birth or baptism. The one thing that seems to make, several theologians have argued this for me, that the one thing that makes Christ different is the resurrection. The resurrection is the real proof that he is divine at whatever level of divinity you want to call it. And you make the important point that the resurrection itself is, from a historical perspective, quite dubious.
It's not dubious. You can't prove that there's a resurrection.
Well, not just dubious, but you argue that there are inconsistencies. That if you look at it, it's again on this likelihood scale. It's not likely that someone who's crucified would even be buried in general. Much less, is it likely that Pontius Pilate, who, if you look at him as a historical figure, would ever have let the Jewish priests have his body for that. And I mean, you go through what's reasonable at that time to say, aside from what people have visions of, you can never, I mean, it was Jonathan Sacks, I guess, or no, Oliver Sacks once said, not Jonathan Sacks, the rabbi, but Oliver Sacks, the psychologist, neurologist, once said that, when people have hallucinations, they're real. So don't, they're just as real as reality. So when people have visions, I'm willing to I don't want to debate that. But the other historical aspects of the tomb, all of that are historically debatable.
They are. The starting point, of course, you start with your sources and see what the sources say about an event.
Mm-hmm.
And when it comes to the resurrection stories, all you have to do is read what Matthew says, what Mark says, what Luke says, and read like in detail. They're contradicting each other all over the map in ways that cannot be reconciled. And so the sources, they all agree that Jesus was buried on a Friday and raised on a Saturday. But then when you start looking at historical evidence for those things, it really gets tricky, because the Romans didn't allow crucified victims to be buried.
Yeah.
This is part of the punishment. They left them to rot on the cross and to be eaten by scavengers as part of the punishment. So people will see, if you want to defy Rome, okay, well, this is what you can expect then. And so the very idea of him being buried that afternoon and then is problematic. The stories of his appearances are problematic. So everything is hugely problematic. And the interesting thing is that when you actually dig through the materials, again, if you line them up chronologically and figure what comes first, it does look like the earliest things people were saying was not that there was an empty tomb. The earliest thing they were saying is that we saw Jesus. And so that's where you get to your visions. And I think people did have visions. I mean, I think, Oliver Sacks, you're right. He wrote a really interesting book on this. On
whole book, Hallucination.
Yeah. But people have these things and they always think that they're true. But the thing is, this is the key point that even theologians don't quite get, which is that if a follower of Jesus, who was a Jew who believed that the end was coming soon, and that the end would involve a judgment day in which everybody who had ever lived will be raised from the dead for judgment. This is what Jesus taught. It's what his disciples firmly believed, that the end of time was coming soon with a resurrection. They didn't believe that when you died, your soul would go to heaven or hell. They didn't think your body and soul could exist separately. If those people came to think Jesus came back to life, their category was that his soul has come back into his body and he's been raised from the dead. They couldn't interpret it that he's gone to heaven and his spirit has come down. And so they naturally interpreted it as a resurrection. So it all does go back to these visions. And you're right, you can't debate them. People see what they see. But there's nothing historical that can suggest.
Well, the visions, so we'll accept that people had visions, but people have visions today, so you can be suspect. But what I found interesting was the rather interesting and clever history looking at the context. As you point out, it's context. And the context of the time is that the tomb being empty and the fact even being a tomb is suspect. And the other thing you point out, which I found interesting, because I keep thinking, how do these people who are evangelical people try and convince people, or I would say con people, into believing this stuff? And I was intrigued that, okay, why do they have women discover him? And because there aren't many women in the Bible. And you point out, well, from many points of view, that's a really good psychological tool to say that the women discover him. You want to mention that?
Well, evangelicals often say, look, those stories must be historically right, because nobody would invent a story of women discovering a tomb. And because if you want to like really show that you'd have the men do it, and man, is that ever wrong? I mean, for one thing, a lot of Christians are attacked early on for being largely a group of women. And they're like more women than men. And you ask who would make up a story of women discovering a tomb? Well, maybe women, for example. I mean, and the other thing is our earliest version of the story is all about our earliest version of the story is in the Gospel of Mark. And Mark's gospel, the entire gospel, is trying to show that the men disciples of Jesus never could figure him out. They just couldn't understand who he was. And so it would make perfect sense for the men not to discover the tomb. They're the ones who can't figure him out. That's the point of the story. And so who would make it? Well, Mark would make it up. And so there are lots of people who would make it up. And I give a lot more of that in the book.
Of course you do. I can't do justice.
So I don't think it's a good argument. I don't think these people are conning people. I think they might be conning themselves, but I think they really. A con artist is somebody who knows that they're wrong.
These people are not kind of con others because they believe it. In fact, as Feynman once said, the easiest person to fool is yourself. So once you really believe it, it's really easy to find ways to try and convince others, which is what
and they
the
didn't
point I
come to
was
believe
making
it.
at the beginning of the program is that I think the people who know there are these contradictions just say, well, it's okay because the story is really true at some level. And I don't want to dwell on the contradictions. I want to get you to believe it, and then we can talk about it.
Yeah. No, I know.
Anyway, no,
Well, that's why I write my books, because I think, people need to realize that, they're just, I have no objection to people being Christian at all, zero. But I think you really ought to know historical facts, and it's better to be informed about the problems than to stick your head in the sand. I mean, if you're not an informed Christian, you're an ignorant Christian. Who wants to be ignorant?
Well, I think most people. Well, I think most people want to be because
I think you're
because
probably
they
right.
find. Well, we'll get to that. I think most people find that. Well, the Dawkins Foundation did a study of people when at one point when in the census in England about a decade ago, they asked for people's religion, and they asked, and then and so the people who listed that they were Church of England, somehow they contacted people, and they said, okay, so why do you believe in transubstantiation? Believe in the virgin birth? Do you believe that? They go, no, 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 no. Well, why do you call yourself a Christian? And I like to think of myself as a good person. So it's ultimately, I think it's as you say, people read and take what they want from it and pick and choose and don't take the things they don't believe. And that's most Christians, except the absolutely literalist ones say, I'm willing to just sort of, I find it makes me a good person. And that's why I call myself a Christian. The other thing that you point out, which is so important in the new book, in the newer book, Armageddon, is that, and at the end also at the beginning and end of how Jesus became God, you point out Jesus was an apocalyptic preacher. His main role was predicting that the end was near. He's like the guys you see on the street now with the signs up. The only difference is that they don't have as big a following. Maybe who knows in 1,000 years, so he was a guy who was going around saying the end is near, not repent so much, but basically repent, be good because the end is near. And he really at least believed it in what he said, and the people around him believed it. And Revelations, which is now through the rapture and in every era seems to be viewed as now there are signs that there's a revelation, that the end is near, was really written by someone who believed the end was near, and this was then, and it was about to happen, and it probably, and well, so why don't you go into that?
Yeah. So my book on Armageddon tries to explain what Revelation really says, and one thing it does not say is that there's a rapture coming.
Yeah, that's amazing.
That's made up.
Yeah.
And you can actually date when that idea came out in 1833.
Yeah, it's amazing when I read that. It's because again, it seems like such a central part of what so many people
say.
about.
The evangelicals believe it, but it's not rooted in the Bible at all. And I go through the passages where people say, "Oh, that's talking about the rapture," and I say, "Yeah, actually, it's not."
Yeah, and you make it quite clear, and again, in historical context, that it's not.
It's not. And Revelation is written by somebody who thinks it's going to come soon. And the problem is that people continue to, many evangelicals and fundamentalists think it's still coming soon. And if you point out that, John said it was coming soon, but he was living 2,000 years ago.
Yeah.
Then they come up with, things like, well, they quote the book of 2 Peter, with the Lord, a day is as 1,000 years and 1,000 years as a day. I say, okay, well, if that's right, then, if Jesus is coming in 3 days, you can start looking for him in 5,023.
Yeah.
So, but, So part of my argument in the book is that both Jesus and John of Patmos, the guy who wrote Revelation, agreed that the end was coming soon, and that it would bring destruction and it would bring salvation. But I think that apart from the general apocalyptic framework that they shared with lots of other Jews in their day, apart from that, they are radically different in how they understood it, and that John actually is not embracing Jesus' teachings at all. I think he's in fact arguing a contrary position to Jesus about God, about love, and about how to live in this world, and how to be.
Yeah. In fact, you point out, well, there's two things there. One is you spent a bunch of chapters, which I was hoping I went for, and they were there, I've had a discussion with my friend Noam Chomsky about belief, and I've been vocal about my views about belief, but and he points out he doesn't care what people think; it's what they do that matters. And I can't help, of course. How can I disagree? The problem is that what people think affects what they do, and as you point out, in a wide variety of ways, misinterpreting revelations has resulted in bad actions. Those actions being um, everything from not buying into um, uh, climate change, or saying it doesn't matter. Humans aren't going to affect the Earth because it's going to end soon. To other areas where you're really actually hurting people in a real way.
It's done. This idea that the end's coming soon has done huge psychological damage to. I mean, I know a lot of evangelicals, ex-evangelicals, who were psychologically damaged by the idea that Jesus is coming back soon, and thinking they knew when it was going to happen. It didn't happen, and just really messed up their heads. Sometimes it's led to huge violence. People don't realize that we're celebrating the 30-year anniversary of the Waco disaster, and that was driven in large part by David Koresh's interpretation of Revelation as being fulfilled in his day.
Yeah, you talk about that in great detail. I was taken by that. And also, I mean, I knew that I know you can't help but know if you follow the news how evangelicals view Israel and the Christian Zionism as being the fulfillment of a prediction from Revelations. But what I guess I hadn't realized so much was, in some sense, how that the Middle East is a source of constant strife in the world, and if you had to think of one place where the flame, the spark might happen that would cause much greater problem, it's the Middle East. But in some sense, the Middle East was designed through the Balfour Declaration, in some sense, by evangelicals to say, we want, before you can have the return, the second coming, we need Israel to be, the Jews to come back to Israel and the temple to be rebuilt. So the first step is to create an Israel. In some sense, that whole political problem arose because of a belief in Revelations and the predictions of the second coming.
Yeah, so in the book, I don't take a stand on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, because that's just
too a can of worms.
That it's too messy. But what I do is explain the historical support of evangelicals for Israel, and even many evangelicals don't understand what the real roots are. And there was Christian Zionism before there was what we think of as Zionism in the 19th century, because Christians were convinced that the prophets had predicted that Israel had to return to the land. And so they predicted that Israel had to come back to the land. And so the Balfour Declaration is all rooted completely in that.
Yeah.
But then there's another part of this, which you alluded to. In the New Testament, it indicates that the Antichrist figure who's going to rise up at the end of time is going to go into the temple of Jerusalem and declare himself God. Well, there is no temple in Jerusalem. It was destroyed by the Romans in the year 70. And where the temple was is where the Dome of the Rock is now, in the Temple Mount. And so fundamentalist Christians are convinced that Israel has to take over the Temple Mount and destroy the Dome of the Rock, this very, very important Islamic holy place, and build the temple again before Jesus can come back. Well, how's that going to happen exactly?
Yeah, that's right.
Without really leading to World War III.
Yeah. It's incredibly dangerous. Well, I want to move at the end here to something interesting, because you point out the other aspect of Revelations, which is almost amusing if it weren't tragic, and Waco is an example of that. Is throughout history, you have people who are saying, I have evidence the end is near. I know what day, and you give great stories about people who say September 21st. No, October 21st. No, the 22nd. And then when it doesn't happen, you point out it doesn't matter. They get more convinced. And you explain in terms of a psychological study on cognitive dissonance. And I want to read this quote because it resonated with me in a way that was slightly different than maybe you intended. You said, if more people acknowledge you're right, it eases the psychological trauma of knowing that you're probably wrong. So you set out to win over other devotees. To me, I can't help but think that is part of the reason that church is necessary in general. Hugh Downs, who you and I know because we're old enough, Hugh Downs became a good friend of mine late in his life, and he said to me that I think that's the reason you need to go to church every day, because these stories are so ridiculous that you suspect in your heart at some level they're not true, and you need to overcome that psychological trauma by being part of with others who believe that, and then set out to win other devotees to convince them. So I think all of evangelicalism, in some sense, is a reflection of the inherent insecurity that people have that this is probably nonsense. What do you think about that?
It may be right. I think there are probably ways to figure that out, but I don't know. Historians have shown that that's one of the reasons, they've argued at least, that's one of the reasons that Christianity took off in the first place. Because the followers of Jesus were expecting Jesus to be the Messiah who destroyed the Romans, and instead he got arrested and tortured to death publicly. And to kind of deal with the dissonance between what they expected to happen and what did happen, they then changed the definition of what the Messiah was and became missionary about it. And then when the second coming didn't come the way they were expecting it to come within their generation, then they became more missionary to convince people. And so it wouldn't be surprising to me if that's still part of what's going on today.
Yeah, I mean, we don't need to go every Sunday to read quantum mechanics, just one book. You have to read it once, but you have to go every Sunday to hear the same stories over again. I think that reinforcing is required specifically because at some level, the cognitive dissonance that is religion. That's my,
you read the quantum mechanics book once. Read the quantum mechanics book once, I'm never going to understand this.
Well, you know you're going to understand, but you don't have to. But you don't have to reread. You don't have to go every Sunday and have and do it over again. Right. And you either know not anyway. I think when I read that, I thought that sums up not just the problem with people who predict the end of the world, but religion in general is you need that constant reinforcement, because most people, I suspect, realize these stories are just too wild.
I'm not sure. That may be right, but I think that most people don't have a scientific way of looking at the world and don't understand the need of evidence. And as you know, they don't believe in proof, and they think that people are just making stuff up. And it's just because they're ignorant. They're ignorant. And I don't think it's necessarily they think that it's wrong. It's just they don't want to think about it much.
Yeah, most people, well, that's the point, come back again. I think people, as you point out, most people believe the Bible but haven't read it because it's easy. I think it's a way of feeling, for that reason they told the census people that I don't need to believe in those details. It makes me feel a good person, and something about it resonates with me, which is the last... Sorry?
It has huge implications. I mean, right now with the abortion debate across the country, everybody thinks that, that abortion is condemned in the Bible. And so you have these people picketing Planned Parenthood. And so even without taking a stand on abortion, the Bible says nothing about it. Yeah. It's not in there at all. But people wouldn't, people don't read the Bible to find out. They just hear somebody quote some random verse out of context and say, oh yeah, see, it condemns abortion. It's got nothing to do with abortion. And so it has really big implications for but you asked earlier why I get passionate about this stuff. Well, this is one of the reasons. I think it ends up mattering.
Oh, it does, and that's why I enjoy your work so much and respect it so much, and why I've enjoyed having the chance to talk to you, because I think you do well. As I said, you're doing God's work, as Steve Weinberg would say, because it is important for people to understand the context of something that affects so many people's lives. But that's why I want to just end with the last question, which is a personal one in some sense, and I hope you'll take it the right way, but. So you're right. And of course you're right, because these things. Abortion is mentioned in the Bible. But what is often mentioned in the Bible, in the Old Testament and New Testament, especially in Revelations, is that, this God condones atrocities. And that God, at least in the sense of Revelation, is supposed to be Jesus. And Jesus talks about judgment and sure, in the Old Testament, there's explicit violence. And as you point out, there's tons of explicit violence in Revelations. So yeah, Jesus talks about love thy neighbor and turn the other cheek, But he also basically said, you're going to be judged, and if you don't believe in me, you're not. It's fundamentally a statement of fear of believe in me because I'll make you afraid if you're not, and I'll kill your children or whatever if you don't, as is said in there explicitly. So, but you basically say you personally like Jesus and the message, and I'm wondering, is that because of, is that just a remnant of a long experience of finding that Jesus helped make you a good person when you were younger, or do you still, as an intellectual exercise, find Jesus ultimately to be a positive figure?
So it's my answer is a little bit complicated because it's a little bit hard for people who to kind of get their mind around it. But the Jesus you described as out for blood, and if you don't believe me, you're going to be roasted. I absolutely do not admire that Jesus.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I don't think that's what Jesus himself was like. When I talk about appreciating Jesus and his message, I'm saying that as a historian who appreciates the conclusions of my historical research. So that I don't think the Jesus of Revelation is at all like the historical Jesus was. I don't think the Jesus of the Gospel of John was at all like the historical Jesus was. As we were talking about earlier, you have these different sources and different gospels, and you have to figure out what's historically right. When I do that, just independently of what I personally believe, which is nothing really about Jesus today, I just think he was a man. But apart from that, when I do that analysis, what looks to me is that Jesus did think the end was coming soon. He was, and it's we absolutely can fault him for that. He was wrong. The end was not coming in his generation. That's completely wrong. I cut him a little bit of a break on that for the same reason that I cut people a break today if they happen to be capitalists. Okay. It's not as if they've got something else that they could see as a viable alternative. I mean, it's not like they've heard about socialism. They think it's the same thing as Marxism. I mean, it's like they grow up in a certain way. Yeah. Well, Jesus grew up in an apocalyptic environment, so I'm going to grant him that part of it. Okay, so I don't share his apocalyptic view, but the way that apocalyptic view worked out for him was distinctive, I think, and not like these other people that we know about, not very much like them. I don't think Jesus said anything about anybody believing in him. I don't think that was part of the pitch at all. Jesus did think that people needed to mend their ways. And especially he thought that the kinds of oppression and cruelty and injustice that was going on in the world was not good, and that people needed to turn away from that. And I think Jesus really did teach that you needed to treat other people well, and that the way you would be approved by God and enter into the kingdom, which is, if you get rid of all that mythology, if you really want to be the kind of human being that you should be, it is by giving of yourself for others and not just living a selfish, self-centered, self-aggrandizing life. And I don't do very good with that. I'm extremely self-aggrandizing, but I do like that message. And I like the idea that I should try to help people who are in need and just not try and screw over everybody so that I can get ahead. And I think Jesus really stood for that. And I think that he thought that those who helped those in need, whatever they believed, they were the people who were in the right. And that's what I believe.
Well, all I can say is amen to that. Literally and metaphorically. No, I think that, and I guess it's wonderful first of all, I appreciate tremendously the time you've taken and the scholarship and the good you've done for all of us by helping us understand things. But I guess, and the wonderful thing is that we can both agree with that philosophy. I argue that I arise there from reason and not faith. Yeah. But but the end result is the same, and I
mean, look, anyway. Immanuel Kant Immanuel Kant, or with deontological ethics, or
Yeah,
John Stuart Mill with
yeah,
utilitarian. These are not built on Christian premises, but they could lead to a very similar view. And so I'm good with that. And it probably is a remnant. I mean, this is what Jesus is
yeah,
is my remnant, not
yeah.
Kantian philosophy.
Yeah, exactly. Given your background, but it's nice to see we've come to the same place, and thanks. It has been such a pleasure and a privilege to talk to you, and I hope I did just some justice to your work. And I really think that the discussion we had, I hope it will get people thinking, which is the whole point of this, and hope you enjoyed it as well.
Well, I enjoyed it very much, and thank you, because it's really nice to talk to somebody who's just a brilliant scholar in a completely different field, but with can actually engage with what strike me as the really important questions for the kind of thing I do. So,
Oh, that's an honor. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed today's conversation. This podcast is produced by the Origins Project Foundation, a non-profit organization whose goal is to enrich your perspective of your place in the cosmos by providing access to the people who are driving the future of society in the 21st century, and to the ideas that are changing our understanding of ourselves and our world. To learn more, please visit originsprojectfoundation.org.